learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating and transformative time, the road to what we often call Sakoku, national isolation.
Yeah, that term itself is interesting, but we'll get to that.
Right. So we're looking at the decisions, the policies, especially in the early Edo period, under Tokugawa Ieyasu and the shoguns who followed him, that kind of led Japan down this very unique path.
It's absolutely crucial because this era shaped Japan for, what, over 2 centuries? Understanding how it happened is key to pretty much everything that follows.
Definitely. And we're not just looking at slamming doors shut. We also want to explore the ways Japan did keep interacting with the outside world. It's more like drawing a very specific kind of border, maybe.
Exactly. It's not a simple on-off switch.
Yeah.
The path to Sakoku, or this controlled state, it's more like a gradual tightening happening over decades. And the reasons behind it are, well, pretty complex, a mix of things.
Okay, let's start unpacking that. Maybe begin with Ieyasu himself. His approach seems quite different from Hideyoshi's before him, right?
Oh, fundamentally different. Hideyoshi's foreign policy had these elements of expansion, even aggression sometimes. Ieyasu, his absolute priority was peace, stability within Japan.
And that changes how you look outwards, I guess?
Completely. It colored how he viewed and dealt with other countries.
We see that pretty early, don't we? That Dutch ship, the Leaf Day, arriving in 1600, that must have been
Hugely significant. I mean, it's the start of direct contact with the Dutch, but it also brings these two really influential figures onto the scene, Jan Justin and William Adams.
Mura Anjin.
That's the one, Euro and Jean. Yeah. They became advisors, trusted ones, helping Ieyasu navigate, well, European diplomacy and trade. It was all pretty new.
And there was already a difference in how they saw different Europeans, wasn't there? The Dutch and English versus the Portuguese and Spanish.
That's a really crucial point. You had the Portuguese and Spanish. They'd been around longer, very focused on missionary work they got called the Southern Barbarians.
Right.
Then the Dutch and English, mainly interested in trade, they were the red-haired people. And it wasn't just, name-calling.
No, it reflected a real difference in perception.
Exactly. The shogunate saw the Spanish and Portuguese, with their history of colonization linked to religion, as a potential political threat. That same worry just wasn't there, initially at least, with the Dutch and English, who just wanted to trade. That perception gap was key.
But it wasn't all about being wary, was it? Ieyasu was actively trying to trade with others too, like Spain, which is interesting given the later situation.
He was, yeah. He sent Tanaka Katsusuke over to New Spain, that's Mexico today, trying to set up direct trade links.
Wow.
And then there's the Kicho Embassy. That's quite a story. Led by Hasekura Tsunaga, sent by the daimyo Date Masamune. Imagine that trip.
Seriously. A Japanese mission heading all the way to Spain in the early 1600s. It really shows the ambition there, from some corners anyway.
It does. But ultimately, it didn't achieve that goal of direct trade with Mexico.
Right. The politics and economics just didn't line up, I suppose.
Pretty much. An amazing effort. Showed Date Masamune was thinking big, but it didn't pan out as a trade route.
So while Ieyasu's doing this diplomacy, he's also starting to put controls on foreign trade. What were those early steps like?
Well, one really significant early move was about the Portuguese trade out of Macau. They were bringing in loads of Chinese raw silk to Nagasaki, very profitable.
Okay.
So to get a handle on that and make sure Japanese merchants got a cut, the shogunate set up the silk reeling system, the Ito Apusedo, in 1604.
Ito Apusedo.
Yeah. Think of it like the shogunate stepping in as the main buyer for all the imported silk. Then they distributed to this select group of licensed Japanese merchants, the Ito Apu Nakama.
Okay. So it controls the flow, maybe stabilizes prices.
Exactly. Stabilizes prices for a key commodity, keeps some profit in Japan, and empowers specific merchant groups loyal to the shogunate. It's quite strategic.
And then you have the shunju, the permits for ships going overseas.
Right, the Red Seal permits. These basically certified that a Japanese ship, a shuinsen, was a legitimate trader, authorized by the shogun, not some pirate crew.
So a way to monitor who's going where, doing what? Official backing?
Precisely. It signals the shogunate wanting oversight, even on international business, a shift from before.
And who was actually doing this trading on these shuinsen?
You saw some powerful daimyo, especially from Kyushu, like the Shimazu clan. They were right in there. Plus, really wealthy merchants from places like Nagasaki, Kyoto,
Yeah.
the big commercial centers.
What were they trading, mainly?
Well, Japan was importing things like raw silk, obviously, silk textiles, sugar, fancy medicinal stuff like aloes wood, rhinoceros horns.
Okay. Valuable stuff.
and exporting things like silver, huge amounts of silver, initially copper, iron.
This sounds like a pretty lively period, actually. Japanese merchants all over Southeast Asia setting up communities.
Oh, absolutely. These Nihonmachi Japan towns, they popped up in various places. It shows how far Japanese trade reached back then.
Any famous examples?
Well, there's Yamada Nagamasa. He became incredibly influential in the Ayutthaya Kingdom in Siam, Thailand today. Rose to really high position.
Wow.
Yeah, it shows a time of real Japanese presence and, integration overseas. Quite different from the later image.
Okay, so that's the wider trade. But closer to home, there were crucial relationships with Korea and Ryukyu. Those needed managing too.
Very crucial. Ieyasu put a lot of effort into restoring ties with Korea after Hideyoshi's invasions had wrecked things.
Right, that makes sense.
And in 1609, you get the Treaty of Giyu. Negotiated by the So clan of Tsushima, they always had close links to Korea and allowed a set number of trade ships each year. 20, I think was.
Okay, limited but official.
Exactly. And then you had the Korean envoys, the Tsushinshi. They were a big deal.
The Tonshinsa missions, what was their main purpose? Celebrating new shoguns?
That was the official reason, yeah, to celebrate the succession. But they were much more than that, huge diplomatic and cultural exchanges.
How many missions were there?
12, between 1607 and 1811. And these weren't small groups. We're talking delegations of maybe 400, 500 people.
Wow, that's a massive undertaking.
It was. They travel from Tsushima, go by sea to Osaka, then overland all the way to Edo. The domains along the route had to make these really elaborate preparations to host them.
Must have been quite the spectacle.
Absolutely. But beyond the ceremony, you had scholars, intellectuals, on both sides meeting, discussing Confucianism, literature, medicine. It kept a certain level of intellectual connection alive, despite everything.
Interesting. So a formal link and a cultural one. What about Ryukyu? That relationship was different again, wasn't it?
Yeah, quite distinct. In 1609, the Shimazu clan, the Satsuma domain, invaded and basically took control of the Ryukyu kingdom.
But didn't Ryukyu still have ties to China?
Yes, and that was the clever part, from the shogunate's perspective. They let Ryukyu maintain its status as a tributary state of Ming China, and later King China.
So Japan could get Chinese goods indirectly.
Exactly. Through Ryukyu. It created this unique sort of back channel for trade, bypassing the need for direct official relations with China, which were complicated.
Okay, so we've got this picture of active diplomacy, controlled trade, these established links. But then things start to tighten up. The mood shifts towards restriction. Why?
It's a convergence of factors, really. One major element is Ieyasu strengthening the anti-Christian policies that Hideyoshi had already started.
Right. Christianity was seen as destabilizing.
Increasingly so.
Yeah.
In 1613, there's a nationwide ban. People like Takayama Ukon, a Christian daimyo, were exiled. And interestingly, the Dutch and English, who had arrived more recently, kind of fanned the flames.
How so?
Well, they pointed out to Ieyasu the way Spain and Portugal operated elsewhere, linking colonization with spreading Catholicism. They basically said, look, these guys are dangerous. It played into existing fears.
So the fear of foreign influence, especially tied to religion, becomes a bigger driver. And this starts to impact trade directly.
Yes, the crackdown on Christianity gets tangled up with controlling overseas contact. The English, for instance, found it hard to compete with the Dutch anyway, and they eventually just pulled out of their trading posts in Hirado.
Okay, they left.
Then, in 1624, the shogunate just cuts ties with Spain completely. And at the same time, they're making it harder and harder for Japanese people to travel abroad.
I remember reading about specific rules, ships needing special permits.
Exactly. By 1633, travel was restricted to these hushosen, which needed not just the usual Shuinju permit, but also a license from the Ruju, the shogun's council of elders. Another layer of central control.
Making it much harder to just sail off.
Much harder. And then the big one comes in 1635. A complete ban on Japanese leaving the country, and an order for any Japanese living overseas to come back.
Wow. That's decisive.
It really is.
Yeah.
A major step towards limiting that direct personal contact with the outside world.
And then the Shimabara Rebellion happens. That feels like a real turning point, something that cemented the move towards this stricter policy.
It absolutely was. The Shimabara Rebellion, 1637 to 38, down in Kyushu. It was significant because many of the people involved in the Shimabara and Amakusa areas were Christians.
What kicked it off? Just the anti-Christian policies.
That was a huge part. Combined with really heavy taxes from the local lords, it created this sort of perfect storm of desperation and resentment.
And this leader emerged, Amakusa Shiro Tokisada.
Yes, a charismatic young figure who led the peasants. They fortified themselves in Hirao Castle. It became a major siege.
How did it end?
They held out for quite a while, nearly half a year, against the shogunate's forces. But eventually, well, they ran out of supplies. The rebellion was crushed, brutally.
And the shogunate's reaction? Predictable, I suppose?
Very. They saw Shimabara as proof positive of how dangerous Christianity was. They blamed the rebellion's strength on the number of Christians involved.
So even harsher measures followed.
Oh, yes. An even stricter crackdown. In 1639, Portuguese ships were banned entirely, just forbidden from arriving. That cut a major historical link.
And that's when things like Fumi started.
Yes, the ifumi, stepping on images of Christ or Mary to prove you weren't a Christian, that was enforced really rigorously, especially in northern Kyushu, near where the rebellion happened.
A terrifying loyalty test.
And alongside that, you get the nationwide systems, a temple registration system, Taraka Seido. Every family had to register with a Buddhist temple and religious scrutiny, Shumon Aratum, ways to monitor everyone, everywhere.
So with all these incredibly strict controls, how did Japan still interact with the outside? We said it wasn't total isolation. What did that limited interaction actually look like?
You're right, it wasn't hermetically sealed. What emerged was this system of very carefully controlled interaction through what historians sometimes call the four gateways.
Or gateways, okay.
Basically, foreign ships apart from Korean and Ryukyuan ones were restricted to only Dutch and Chinese vessels, and they could only come to Nagasaki, nowhere else.
And the Dutch got moved, didn't they? From Hirado to Dejima and Nagasaki Harbor. That sounds very deliberate, like confinement.
It was exactly that. Dejima was this tiny, man-made, fan-shaped island. That's where the Dutch had to live and trade. Very restricted.
But it was still a window, right?
A crucial one. It was the shogunate's main source of information about Europe and the wider world through the Oranda Fusetsugaki.
The Dutch reports.
Yeah, the head of the Dutch trading post had to submit these detailed reports regularly about what was happening overseas. Dejima itself, it had houses, warehouses, even gardens, but Japanese access was super controlled. You needed permission from the Nagasaki magistrate.
Okay. And the Chinese, they kept coming to Nagasaki, too.
They did, yes. Even after the Ming dynasty fell and the king took over in China, Chinese ships continued to arrive. But their trade also faced more and more rules over time.
Were they confined, too?
Eventually, yes. In 1688, they established the Tujin Yashiki, the Chinese quarter, also in Nagasaki, another designated controlled residential area.
So a very tightly managed system, everything funneled through specific controlled points. And this whole setup, the Sakoku policy, it lasted for ages, didn't it?
It really did, over 200 years. And that had a massive impact, obviously. It limited foreign influence on Japan's industry, its culture.
And strengthened the shogunate's control, presumably?
Hugely. It was central to maintaining Tokugawa power and stability for that long period.
What about the word itself? Sakoku, you mentioned it was interesting. When did people actually start using that word?
Yeah, it's funny, the term Sakoku, chained country or closed country, wasn't really used during the Edo period itself.
Oh, really?
Its first known appearance is actually quite late, 1801. A translator, Shizuki Tadao, used it when he was translating parts of Engelbert Kampfer's History of Japan. He called his translation Sakoku Ron Discourse on the Closed Country.
Huh. So it's a later label.
Pretty much. It became more common later, especially in contrast to Kaikoku, the opening of the country in the 19th century. And scholars still debate, is national isolation even the right way to put it?
Because of the gateways.
Exactly. When you factor in the continued regulated contact through Nagasaki with the Dutch and Chinese, through Tsushima with Korea, Satsuma with Ryukyu, and even Matsumai up north with the Ainu people, those four gateways kept Japan connected in specific ways. Isolation feels a bit too simple.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've kind of traced this journey from Ieyasu's initial openness, well, relative openness, through all these increasing controls, driven by worries about Christianity, stability, leading to this very managed system of interaction. It's definitely more complex than just closed.
Absolutely. It was a gradual evolution, a series of calculated steps responding to specific pressures and goals, not just flipping a switch off.
That really changes the perspective. And it makes you think, even with these controls, Japan wasn't totally cut off. These managed connections, the information coming through Dejima. How did that shape Japan internally over those 200 years? And how did this specific brand of isolation with its little windows ultimately affect how Japan dealt with the pressure to reopen in the 1850s?
Yeah, how did that unique experience prepare, or maybe not prepare, Japan for what came next? This is a great question to ponder.